Hello, this is Ozzie Ostwalt, and welcome to Religion and Life. It is sometimes said that the Bible is the best-selling book in history and the least read book in history. Reading and interpreting the Bible is difficult, and as a result, there is widespread biblical illiteracy in our culture. Dr. Rodney Duke, today's guest, teaches classes on biblical literature at Appalachian, and is here to talk about how we can read the Bible more analytically and perhaps understand it better. Thanks for joining us, Rodney.
Oh, you're welcome.
I appreciate it. So you've been at Appalachian for a couple of decades now.
Almost 30 years.
Almost 30 years. And tell us about what you've taught during those years, what you write about, what your interests are.
Well, I mainly teach the same thing over and over again, which I enjoy.
Right.
I teach the intro to New Testament, introduction to Old Testament, biblical interpretation or hermeneutics, and then one of my most favorite classes recently has been Bible and Science, because there's such a polarization in our culture over those issues, and yet historically there hasn't been, and students don't know that. There's a lot of mythology, so I'll get some religion students and some science students, and makes for a good class.
I bet your students come in with some expectations that get shattered pretty quickly.
Oh yeah, there's just a lot of mythology in our culture, even about Galileo and how long people thought the world was flat, and they're surprised to learn what the historical trajectories have been.
Right. So have you noticed a change over the last 3 decades in students, or has the way you teach the Bible and try to communicate with students changed?
Well, a couple of things have changed. One, they're less biblically literate.
Okay.
They might not even have heard of Moses.
Really? Yeah.
That doesn't bother me too much, because I'm willing to have people who don't know anything about the Old or New Testament come in class and teach them about it. Actually, it's sometimes the people who think they're biblically literate, particularly maybe with the parables of Jesus, who have always heard them in terms of platitudes, who really haven't looked at them in terms of their impact in context. The other change I'm sure you've noticed is that students are less prepared to be independent learners. The skills of analysis and synthesis for reading and writing and dealing with literature are not at the level they used to be when I started, that's for sure.
So there's a couple of things in your answer there that I want to follow, maybe one at a time. But first of all, there's a more widespread illiteracy concerning the biblical text in and of itself. So that suggests that young people aren't reading the Bible as much, perhaps.
Right.
Secondly, if they are reading it, they're reading it differently in their own, I guess, church context than they are in the classroom context. And then thirdly, you mentioned a kind of inexperience with analytical reading of text in general. So let's take that the first one first. What do you how do you account for the more widespread biblical illiteracy? It's certainly not access. I mean, the Bible is everywhere.
Right. Well, I think you alluded to it. Everybody's got a Bible in their home, maybe 2 or 3.
Right.
But
I brought 4 here today.
But that doesn't mean people read it.
Right.
And it is difficult because it is literature from a different time period or time periods in different cultures, and particularly when you're dealing with the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, Jewish scriptures, people get lost and don't know what's going on. So if they haven't had some introduction, even the New Testament, if they don't know that there's 4 Gospels that are repeating some of the same material, they get confused pretty easily. So I think having a Bible and actually feeling comfortable reading it don't go together. They're just not comfortable.
Sometimes I find, too, that if there is a Bible, perhaps it's in archaic language, and that doesn't help understanding very much. One of the Bibles I have here today, of course, is the beloved King James Version, and it's very difficult reading, even though it's English. The words are different, the sentence structures are different.
Yeah. Something I'd encourage people to do is look up on the internet and get the original preface to the King James. Most of the King James that we have a very abbreviated preface, but the original preface says the exact same thing that any modern translation says. It says that the target language has changed over the years. We know people have their favorite versions that they like, but the target language changes, so there's always a need for a new updated translation.
Right.
And so the King James translator said the exact same argument anybody would have today, but it's generally not there in the prefaces.
So some traditions have almost deified the King James
Right.
Version and don't look kindly toward these modern versions. Now, so you're alluding to this kind of ongoing translation of the Bible. There are new translations coming out all the time, I would imagine.
Yeah.
And oftentimes they're done by groups of scholars. So it's even though you might be a biblical scholar and an expert in the ancient languages, it's still a daunting task to try to come up with a translation that's understandable and effective.
Yeah, right. Some of the best, I think, translations have worked with two kind of committees. One is the actual language experts who then bounce it off a literacy committee to see if it's communicating in contemporary English well.
Mm-hmm.
And then they have this dialogue and then produce a product.
Okay. Well, you mentioned historical context, and we'll come back to that. But you also alluded to the fact that the original languages of the biblical text are difficult to penetrate unless you're a scholar like yourself. And I have a couple of images of ancient text. Some people haven't seen Hebrew, some people haven't seen Greek. So if we could get those on the screen and just to look at them, it's tough going here, but it looks like we have a Hebrew text, an ancient Hebrew text here. Just looking at it's beautiful script, but you studied for years and years to be able to read this, right?
It depends on the block script I can read pretty well, but the handwritten is different. One of the things that's important to note is most of my students do not know that that most of the words were run together.
Right.
There's even possibility sometimes of dividing them up differently, so translators have to work with that. But even beyond that, even when it's pretty clear, the chapters were added later, the verse was added later, paragraph divisions were added later, spaces were added later, and then all of those headings that they have in their Bible, their editorial work of the translators. And a lot of students depend on those too much.
Right.
In fact, I don't use the real popular study Bible that a lot of professors use at school because I don't want my students having all of those notes and aids and comments yet. I want them to be making their own observations about the text and then go to the experts.
Yeah, and you can see in this text that, there's no punctuation, there's no division, so that adds to the difficulty of getting an accurate translation sometimes.
Yeah.
I think I've got a second image here, a second text, which is a Greek manuscript. It's not very clear, but you can still get an idea of the same sort of phenomenon going on here. There's no punctuation, no divisions. And then that increases the possibility of perhaps getting a mistranslation. So one of the first things I guess that some people may be unaware of is that we take for granted that we have English translations or vernacular translations. But really, I guess if you wanted to really study in depth, you had to have some sort of working knowledge of these ancient languages.
Well, you remind me of one of the big confusions students have is the difference between establishing the text through text criticism and translation. Students have this idea that the text went from translation A to translation B to C to D, and now we have this very corrupt translation. That's not the case at all. One discipline is working with all of the texts that we have and coming up with a composite earliest best reading, and that's text critics.
Right.
And then you have, as you know, translators who are working with that latest text and latest understanding in Greek and Hebrew. So it's a very false notion, but common, to think that the text has been translated so many times that it's just lost its original meaning. That's
so it's the opposite then. The more sophisticated we get and the more the text evolves, gives us the possibility at least of having a more accurate
more text
reading.
criticism has evolved in our language understanding. Yeah.
Right. Okay. That's interesting. Yeah. Now another kind of text I brought here today. So we've been talking about translation. There's another back when I was a teenager, a very popular version of the Bible came out, and this is actually a paraphrase copy. It's not the only paraphrase, but could you distinguish between a paraphrased Bible and a translation of a text?
Well, so that actually brings up the person who was paraphrasing, who came up with the Living Bible, was using the King James, and his children didn't understand it.
Right.
And so it immediately brought up the need. They couldn't understand what he was talking about. So he put it in his vernacular and very common proprietary language for his age level of his kids. So paraphrases do that. They tend not to work with the original text very closely, and they're trying to hit a very specific target audience of a certain age range vocabulary range and so forth. And they can do devices of modernizing the text. Instead of a Samaritan traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho, he could be going from Athens to Atlanta. And so you have like what was the Cotton Patch paraphrase version,
right. So I guess there's value in that, but you just need to be aware of what you're reading,
right,
or why you're reading that particular version.
There's always the problem of there's concepts in the original language that don't translate literally into the target language, and so there's always some need for idiomatic translation, not word for word, but phrase for phrase or concept for concept.
So it's a tough job. I'm glad somebody's out there doing it.
So remember, in Revelation it says Jesus standing at the door knocking.
Right.
So for some Wycliffe Bible translators in this village that they're working with, that meant he was a thief. So the problem they face then is either having footnote after footnote explaining things into the culture, or they would do an idiomatic translation and say Jesus is standing outside the hut. And then it would communicate the same point of he's there to be received hospitably.
So knocking in that particular culture was knocking the door down?
Well, it was, in that culture you were expected to basically come on in, but if you were trying to discern if there were people in there, if it was occupied, you might be making a noise on the outside.
You're up to no good.
Right.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So idiom is important.
Yes.
Now I know I've always admired your dedication to teaching in the classroom. I wonder if you could share some of the techniques you use in the classroom in order to engage students in a topic like biblical literature. I imagine many of your students are interested to begin with, but I would imagine others come for a variety of reasons, and it may be difficult to get those students engaged in the topic.
Backing up just a bit, I think I see my job now, before I even get into the proprietary nature of biblical literature in my classes, I'm wanting to whet their appetite to be independent learners, to motivate them to be learners. And so, but what I try to do then is have a balance of not just lecture. Need some lecture for getting some information through quickly, but I try to develop both assignments and exercises that get them to discover things, to make observations, that give them maybe some tools of categories to be looking for, and then to look for those things, because if they discover them themselves, it's going to stick with them. If all of a sudden the principle makes sense, they'll stick with them. And so along with that, kind of self-discovery, which I try to integrate, it's hard to design an assignment that doesn't give away what you want them to see,
right, yeah.
but is not too vague, so it kind of leads them to that discovery. And the other is I use a lot of talking in class in pairs or in groups, because if they see something and they can articulate it, then they're beginning to synthesize that thought. And that's really when the learning takes place. So writing down my notes is not learning.
Right.
Rereading notes is the least effective way to prepare for a test next to doing nothing. So if I can get them to talk through what they're learning, talk through what they're seeing, talk through their assignments, and sharpen one another, that's where I think the learning's taking place.
Yeah, I always enjoy walking down the hall and passing by your classroom and see students doing things. It's an energy that's different from a lecture style.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that. So one of the things I think, I teach New Testament occasionally. I'm not the biblical scholar that you are, but one of the things that we always pay attention to when we're teaching the Bible is historical, cultural context. And I know that's particularly important for you. And I pulled a graph off the internet to illustrate this. This may not be the graph you would use in your class, but maybe we could use this as a way of talking about the importance of understanding the context of these texts that we're dealing with.
Right, so all of those contexts are important, and we talked a little bit when I saw that earlier. I might change it differently, but one thing that's really missing here is for the students to think about the target audience. Because that's what points us to those background issues.
Right.
They are not the target audience. Now, for people who are part of
your students, your 21st year students are not the target audience.
They're not the target audience of the biblical literature.
Right.
So as people of the community of faith, their understanding of revelation and inspiration, I'm part of the community of faith, is that these texts have value through time and space and culture, and that they are for the communities of faith that hold them. But they were not written to us. They were written to an audience in the first century for the New Testament. And so that's when if I can get them thinking, this wasn't written to you. it was written to a first century audience, and then these things come into play.
Right.
Well, what language, what were the idioms, what were the figures of speech, what's going on historically, what's going on culturally, what's going on politically, what were the burning issues that people felt worth fighting for? Why did they even write Gospels? What was their biases? What were their presuppositions? What were their agendas for their target audience? And I find right now, about a quarter of the way through the semester, I'm getting several students saying, I never thought about that I was not the target audience. Never thought about that, and now it's changing my perspective. If I'm going to know what the scriptures mean to me, I kind of need to know what it meant to the people in the era for which it was written.
Right.
These were works of communication. And so what was going on within the context of that communication involves all those things, as well as I'd add genre, the kind of literature.
Right. And that's tricky, just trying to get students to identify with the target audience, because the Bible contains text from over hundreds and thousands of
Periods
years.
Periods of time,
different cultures. So you've got not one target audience with the Bible, but many. So I guess if you were going to teach Paul's epistle to the Romans, one of the first things you would try to do is get students to identify as a Roman citizen in the first century, and what the concerns were of the day. Is that?
Well, particularly with Romans, but all of Paul's letters, every reader needs to realize that you've got this first time kind of encounter of Jews with Gentiles coming together for worship. And Paul's always trying to address the conflicts that are coming in from these cultures and different perspectives, and what it means, because the scriptures are the Hebrew scriptures, the Jewish scriptures. There's no New Testament at this time.
Right.
So the backdrop is always this blend of what it means that Gentiles are coming into this early Christian worship and being addressed by the letters. And again, the modern Christian tends to read all those letters as if they're written to me and not to an audience that was struggling with a lot of these issues.
So it sounds to me like there's a great possibility, maybe even probability, that a reader of a text today, if they're reading from that perspective, the text was written to me, could misappropriate the text, apply it falsely or inaccurately.
Oh yeah, definitely. I don't know how much time you have, but in Ephesians, that first introductory chapter to Ephesus has all this language that people use to appropriate a theology for predestination and so forth. But if you read it in context, he's saying, we were predestined, we were foreordained, we were chosen for this purpose, for this purpose, for this purpose. And he goes, and you too. And now he begins to address the Gentiles. So when a modern person is thinking the we is me, they've missed the whole distinction Paul has made between the Jews that Paul is representing as somebody who's accepted the Messiah, and the Gentiles are being grafted in. And so you get all these proof texts where people take out these terms and use them for their theological purposes without seeing that it's shifted from we to you.
So
that's a very controversial text to bring up.
No, this is tricky. Right?
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
So this is this kind of underscores your emphasis that readers of the Bible need to be analytical readers. There's more than just. I mean, there's a lot going on here: history, culture, language.
Right. Well, I'm not the target audience. So I want my students to think, well, who is the we that's Paul's talking about?
Right.
And all of a sudden, he's just shifted now to you. So who's the you? And so those kind of observations are major observations.
So do you ever have a student say, well, if I'm not the target audience, does that mean the text is not relevant to my life? I mean, is there that temptation to, I guess, distance oneself from the text? Is that a danger as well, or?
I don't think so. We're at a state secular university, and I make it clear that not there to be preaching or to discourage them about the use of the text in their own faith walk. But I think they begin to see that if it's going to mean something to them now, it's good for them to understand what it has meant in the past to the original audience. And so I think that actually tends to enrich their applications now rather than turn them off.
Now, I'm sure you've encountered this. I sometimes get kickback from students about encouraging them to read the Bible analytically because they've been told somewhere in their past that they shouldn't question things about the text, that they should just read it and take it as it's written. Is that something you encounter?
It is. One of my in-class exercises that I like the best is I have them read an excerpt from types of literature that are current today. They just read the first few lines, and then I show them how they are recognizing what genre that is from just a few clues. And then we begin discussing how they're actually reading each one of those genres differently. And then they begin to think, well, that applies to the biblical literature. I can't read it all on the flat. Some of it's narrative, and in the narrative there's parables, there's letters, there's apocalyptic. For the Old Testament, there's legal literature, prophetic oracles.
Right.
And so they begin to realize that on an everyday basis, they're encountering all sorts of different types of literature, and there's also all sorts of different types of literature in the biblical literature. And that's a real eye-opening experience. And then to think that they've got to read each of those types differently for their function, their purpose, their key literary features. So
you're retraining, in a sense, you're retraining students to use the same analytical techniques that they use in their other classes, or in the English department or in the history department, and applying those techniques to the Bible.
Yeah, and that genre exercise is a real eye-opening experience. And I actually get students saying that they're now reading their other texts better in the English literature classes and in their other classes because they're much more aware of what they're doing as readers.
Right.
They would have just said they read all these types of literature, but now they realize they distinguish one type from another. They read each type differently from another. And so what I tell them is we're becoming metacognitive about reading. We're learning what we do when we read. We're learning what we do when we write to communicate skillfully. Yeah. And so they're finding that those are universal skills that apply to their other classes.
And you're happy when they make that observation.
Oh, yeah.
I can tell.
Yeah.
That's, if you get them to that point in a semester, then I would say you have been quite successful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I feel like we just scratched the surface here. Maybe I can have you back and we can talk about some contemporary themes and how the Bible might address those things. If you'd be willing, I'd love to have you back as a guest later in the semester. That's great. Well, I encourage you to keep doing what you're doing. You're really very skilled at it, and we're happy to have you here at Appalachian. And I know your students are learning how to read, and I know they are. Yeah. So thank you, Rodney. I appreciate you joining us today. Well, that's it for this week on Religion and Life. Join us next week when we'll explore the ways religion can inform our efforts to protect and preserve our environment. Until then, this is Ozzie Ostwalt.